Good day, everyone. I hope everyone's ready for a fantastic few hours of invasive alien species discussions. My name is Nikki Stokes. I am the Joint Secretary of the PIANC Working Group 218, which is a working group looking at the implications for waterborne transport infrastructure in managing invasive alien species, in particular marine invasive species. So thank you all for joining us. I've got a few slides here, but first I thought that I'd break the ice a little bit and shoot out some questions for everyone. Hopefully it will be appearing in your platform as some polling questions, and we'd like to have a bit of a snapshot of what type of information everyone knows and hopefully share some fun facts. I find them fun anyway. So the first one is how many invasive alien species, marine species, could you expect to find in 1 litre of untreated ballast water from a commercial international vessel? Hopefully you should all see that poll and be able to select from the multiple choice answers in front of you. Please feel free to select whichever one you think is the best answer. And we will wait to see what we get out of that. And then we'll discuss the answer. In the meantime, I will flick over to my first slide and see whether and give you a bit of an introduction of PIANC. So PIANC is a worldwide network of professionals. We look to provide expert advice on cost-effective and sustainable waterborne infrastructure, and the leading partner for governments and the private sector in the design, development and maintenance of ports, waterways and coastal areas. It's been around since 1995. There is a massive wealth of information out there in the way of guidelines and publications that have been brought together and published by the PIANC network of professionals, and it really is a wealth of information. So I would very much recommend that you have a bit of a look around on the website, and especially if you're in the maritime industry, there is all sorts of interesting things to find there. Okay, so we've got some answers here to our polling questions. Thank you so much for being involved in that. So the first question was, how many invasive species could you expect to find in 1 litre of untreated ballast water? So 45% of you said approximately 500 organisms. 50% of you said approximately 20. And the remainder, 5% said the remainder. So we have the answer being approximately 50 organisms. Okay, so the second question is what is the approximate damage cost to Australian assets if there were no biosecurity controls? Now, I know we're an international forum here, so we've probably got a lot of people from all over the world, and this is a very Australian specific question, but don't worry, I've got a global one next. So we have 62% said up to $13.4 billion per year is the approximate damage to Australian assets. 15% said up to $5 million per year. So the answer is, and the last one was over $1 billion a year, and 23% selected that. So you were majority correct. It is $13.4 billion per year is the approximate cost to Australian assets alone. So what we're dealing with here is very much an extremely important topic and well worth some time today. The third question is, what is the approximate cost from aquatic invasions to the global economy per year? Told you I'd do a global one, so this is it. Excuse me. 10% said that it was $345 billion equivalent US. 90% said over US $1 trillion. And no one selected the last one. which was up to US $5 billion. Yes, that was really quite low. So interestingly enough, we pitched it a bit too high there. So no, it's actually the equivalent of $345 US billion per year. The last question I have today for the beginning of this event is, how much of these costs would you expect to be related to asset damages? I guess this really gets down to the crux of why we're all here today, and why we feel that we need to look at ways to become better at managing and mitigating the risks associated with invasive alien species the best we can, given the static infrastructure that ports and harbours and marinas have within the natural environment. So how much would you expect to be related to asset damages? 64% of you said up to 45%. 27% of you said up to 10%. And 9% said up to 70%. Well, interestingly enough, the answer is up to 70% of those costs could be expected to relate specifically to asset damages. So that may come as a bit of a surprise to many of you. So I guess that was a little bit of an icebreaker. I really just wanted to get everyone into the groove of what we're talking about today, and to see how much you knew, I guess. So that was a little bit of a trial from my perspective. So well done, you all passed. Excellent. Moving on to my next slide. So I guess this builds on what I just said earlier. PIANC provides really high quality technical reports within our international commissions and working groups. We look to create a worldwide network of the best international experts that we can on each specific topic that we develop such guidance on. In fact, we seek out and request applications from all over the world in order to ensure that we select the best people to be able to try to provide the best advice that we can from an industry representation perspective. We also look to support both young professionals and countries in transition. So we feel that that's an extremely important role to play, especially in the international community. Industry advice really needs to be able to capture both your developing and your developed nations, and offer advice that can be sound and implementable for both. We also look to ensure that we can connect with those communities through international, regional and local events. So if you go on the website, you'll see a little bit more about where we hold events, not just necessarily on this type of webinar platform. So working group 218, that's a nice number. Essentially, why are we here? So the group that you see in front of us and the speakers that you'll hear from today, majority of them are directly involved in the working group, and our objective is to develop a practical guidance to cover off on the business, liability and health and safety risks associated with invasive alien species for waterborne transport infrastructure. Our audiences cover port managers, harbour masters, engineers and environmental professionals within that industry or servicing that industry. We really do look to complement, but not necessarily duplicate, the work focused on vessel risk management. So there was a question earlier on vessels, but we really do acknowledge the significant amount of work that's being done in the guidance and regulatory space for vessel management, and we're really looking to complement that work. So I will now pass on to our first speaker today, Safra Altman. She is our working group chair, and she is here today to present on everything that we've been doing. So take it away, Safra.
Hello, well, good morning and good afternoon and good evening, depending on where you are in the world. For me, I'm at just after 5 a.m. And I think having folks, we have folks from, well, Nikki, who just spoke, Dr. Stokes, and our some of our guest speakers are all in, late evening, nighttime. And so I think that actually speaks to how important and interested we all are in this work, that we're excited to work collaboratively and ready to be on at various times throughout the day and night. So, and we're glad that you're here that you're also interested. And so Nikki did a great job of queuing me up and explaining the rationale for the working group. We started working together a few years ago in person, right before when that was possible, and have worked through the pandemic to now a point where we hopefully will meet in person again soon as we finish up our report. And so the group is represented by 5 different countries, folks in academia, in industry, and in government. And our objective is to develop this practical guidance. So we want to look at invasive aquatic risks to business, liability, health, and safety. And these risks are to waterborne transport infrastructure. Our audience is port managers, harbor masters, engineers, environmental scientists. And as Nikki highlighted, there's been lots of work focused on the vessel risk management component. And obviously that's very, very important. But because there is so much work on it, this work our working group really focuses on the complementary piece for transport infrastructure and doesn't duplicate that vessel risk piece. I'm just getting used to pointers. Apologies. Go back. So I know you all have answered some questions, and you're here, so you probably have an idea of what invasive aquatic species are, but just a brief that we're talking about non-native plants and animals here. While there are also non-native bacteria and pathogens, diseases, we're not really focusing on that within our analyses and our report, but that is part of the issue as well. We know that there's been an increase in introductions globally, primarily for marine invasive species, primarily due to the following invasion pathways: vessel-based, within the vessel, so ballast water, and outside of the vessel, biofouling organisms, the aquaculture trade, and the aquarium trade. All of those present their own challenges in terms of management and in terms of the risk they pose to our infrastructure. There we go. And as we talk about the risks posed by vessels, which are the predominant vector for moving marine organisms around the world, here just some overall stats or factoids. If we look at the annual trade worldwide throughout seaports, and these are just 2 countries for comparison, in the US, we have about 1.5 billion short tons coming in and out of seaports, which represents 70% of our trade. In Australia, it's 2.3 billion deadweight tons. You'll notice that those are 2 different metrics. That's about 200 pounds or I think 1,000 kilograms different. So it's not very much different per type of ton. But Australia has much more seaport trade, being an island country and a large island. 98% of that of trade in general in Australia is through seaports. So that's a huge, not only is the marine vessel traffic a big vector for Australia and the US, that's also a big component of trade. And the world commercial fleet grew by 63 million between 2020 and 2021. So that's a huge increase. Now, we're not focusing on the vessels and treatment or management of ballast or hull fouling on vessels, but that movement of those vessels themselves is critical to thinking about the biosecurity and the impact of invasive species on marine transport infrastructure. And that's what the so what, right? So, okay, well, again, why do we think this is so important that we spent a few years trying to produce this document and analyze the problem? Well, as you guys already have I guess not talked about, but thought about with our opening icebreaker questions, globally invasive species are costing this amount of money, time, and effort to deal with. These costs are principally related to asset damages. So something that I think our audience is probably pretty interested in is, well, then how do we reduce those damages? What are effective strategies for minimizing them? I apologize, my internet is saying it's a little wonky, so let's cross our fingers that my audio stays. Someone can hopefully alert me if that doesn't work. From an Australian perspective, the value of the Great Barrier Reef area has, so that's an extremely valuable World Heritage Site and biologically, and 12 of 16 ports in that area are adjacent to the reef. So that means that there's lots of impacts from the infrastructure and the ships coming to serving as vectors to that infrastructure. I've translated some of these numbers into US dollars just for consistency on this slide. So the numbers are slightly different from your questions, but $173 billion per year of benefits come from are vulnerable, of Australian assets are vulnerable to invasive species, and up to about $9 million in US dollars per year are potentially damaged marine infrastructure if there are no biosecurity controls enacted. So those are some big financial impacts that also could have big biological impacts. So what are some of the risks? Some of the risks to port infrastructure include compromising the infrastructure itself, so blocking pipes, having lots of organisms or plants attached to the infrastructure or floating infrastructure that can deteriorate or weigh it down. There can be navigational safety issues, so some organisms can actually, as ecosystem engineers, they can degrade or change the structural integrity of a bank or even of your same way that they're doing it for the actual infrastructure. They may be deteriorating the natural infrastructure in the area. Organisms can actually alter hydrodynamics and sedimentation rates. We have some examples of that further along in the talk. And so all of these things impact maintenance and the longevity of the infrastructure itself. And so those also relate to operational costs and strategies for risk reduction. As I was saying, there's also operational impacts. So here's some examples of different marine invasive species that have caused operational impacts. On the left, we have an invasive sea squirt species. It's an example of it's a sea squirt, an example of a species that can grow all over hard substrate and can weigh it down, can weigh down buoys and moorings. It actually, there are also filter feeders, and they can affect the larval stages of shellfish, sometimes commercially important shellfish, and reduce their yields, the yields of the shellfish. Phycopammatus is an Australian tube worm. It actually develops worm reefs with it because it has a calcareous tube. They can be very large, up to 12 meters wide. And because they're so large and they're developing these structures within the with the seafloor, they can actually change the hydrodynamics. They can increase sedimentation. They can render port areas unusable. In Whitehaven Marina in England, some of these species, the species was found to grow so quickly and grow and crust engines on vessels, so it actually caused some vessel engines to fail. Another example of restricting operational activities is this red-billed mudworm. Because it's a designated new invasive species, it can actually, in some countries, can impact a port's license to carry out dredging, because dredging may move the organism to new places. So that could restrict operational activities if a certain marina is deemed as a site that has this species. There may maintenance dredging or deepening may not be able to occur there. Another example is these jellyfish that clog waterways, block intake pipes, and can cause, a lot of inconvenience and access issues. Some more examples include for structural impacts. So we were talking about operational impacts. Moving into some structural impacts. We have structural impacts that include burrowers, clogging, and fouling. Examples of burrowing organisms include these wood-boring actual bivalves. They have a common name as shipworms, but they're actually bivalves. They are through wood. They have caused worldwide over $1 billion annually. In San Francisco Bay, they arrived in 1919 and 1921, and more than $900 million worth of damage between 1919 and 1921, they caused more than $900 million worth of damage to the wooden piers and the wharfs in San Francisco. And their ongoing current cost of managing in that region is about $2 million per year. The signal crayfish, which we see bottom here, is actually signaling, right? So this species burrows up to 2 meters below the water sediment interface. And that burrowing, as you can imagine, if there's a lot of crayfish and they're creating 2-meter deep burrows, they can really change the stability of the riverbanks and cause collapse. They increase the silt load in the water, and that increases, that combination leads to increased flood risk. So they've actually cost Great Britain approximately 3 million pounds annually to deal with. We have some examples of invasive plants in the clogging picture that can, in a clogging species can cause navigational problems. It can impact locks and lock chambers and make it difficult for boat traffic to go through. In Arkansas, the lock gates were repeatedly opened and closed to deal with aquatic invasive plants. And because of the additional maintenance, opening and closing, they actually had maintenance issues, and their lifespan for those locks was reduced. So that translates into additional costs for repair and new equipment. I'm going to move forward with get into some meat of the talk. So we are looking at the business and commercial, we're touching on in our report on the different types of liability that marine and managers should be thinking about when it comes to invasive species. There are both statutory liabilities. So are there punitive or legislative consequences? For example, in some countries, there might be quarantine orders or movement orders if there are specific species found in but in addition to the liability, the statutory liability, there might also be reputational liability issues. So you may have, there may be a history of species or a reputational risk because it's known that a certain marina or port or infrastructure area has certain species that are a risk, and that may change traffic patterns to your marina, for example, because it may change it may reduce your business because there's a reputational risk of having those organisms there and potentially transferring them to other places. A very important component of our report is looking at biosecurity planning, looking at the importance of risk assessment, baseline surveys, species risk profiles, and thinking monitoring and adaptive management plans and operation and maintenance plans. The invasion curve is essentially, once we've seen species and numbers, we've already passed the part where they've established, and we usually find species when it's very difficult to manage them. And so that means that it's very important to monitor early, to be proactive, and really spend it's more equitable, it's more efficient to spend time on being proactive, looking for species early and managing from that perspective than managing species once they're already there. And so we highlight some of the different proactive prevention methods for managers to focus on. These include modification controls, so physical locks and barriers, deterrents. They can be electrical, acoustic. These are just some examples. Chemical manipulation and biofouling coatings, of course. We recommend feasibility analyses, looking at the costs and risks and probabilities of invasive species coming in. We also focus in on design and implementation and non-target considerations. Here's an example in Illinois, outside of Chicago, where, and this is a big push with the Corps of Engineers, $30 million project, I believe, or $20 million. And the solutions that have been, the design solutions include integrated controls. So it's a number of different types of controls in one setting. And these are to reduce the risk of invasive carp spread, as well as there's some invasive invertebrates. The focus really is on reducing the risk of carp movement. Apologies for the dog in the background. The challenges, of course, are getting stakeholder engagement and buy-in from all of the stakeholders, and a huge challenge on biosecurity management, and which includes looking at species risk, looking at how monitoring techniques and implementing monitoring plans, and of course, incorporating education into all of those things. And for the last, very quickly, I'm just going to highlight why are we including this with climate? So as we know, climate change is real, and the predictions are that we will have a more acidic ocean environment with less oxygen and higher temperatures. And these changes will have impacts on waterborne transport infrastructure that include changes to bathymetry, erosion, weather, wind speed, direction, and duration, and then changes in actual temperature, cold, heat, chemistry of the water, and biology. And so all of those can impact the waterborne infrastructure, but also many of them directly impact the invasive species. And some of those invasive species, like we've said already, also have an impact back to the risk. And so why do I bring up both of these? Because in addition to the climate change impacts on each waterborne infrastructure by itself, invasive species community by itself, we have an interaction between the two. And so there's actually combined impacts. So the problem gets much stickier. I don't really have much time. I don't know that I have time, but just to show that there actually has been, there's been an increase in the temperature in traffic patterns from ocean vessel going traffic patterns from Rotterdam to Yokohama. And this is both in the route that goes through the Suez Canal and the North Sea. And this means that vessel traffic is changing. Opening of the Arctic shipping passages is contributing to that. And so that means that species are going to be moving around in different ways. And they're also going to be exposed to warmer, different habitats, meaning that not only is there a species introduction, but those introduced ranges are getting bigger. And so I need to wrap it up because I don't have time, but you can see there's a lot here. I do have some questions if we have time. If not, we can probably use them for part of the discussion. But thank you for the time, and hopefully I've queued it up, given you some interest for our report. We're hoping to have it done in the late fall, and I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Safra. That was absolutely fantastic. We are a little bit short on time, but we do have a couple of poll questions that have come through. So please have a go at these, and we'll collect your answers and quickly run through them to the rest of the audience. We also have some questions that have come through to us here, all of the speakers. We might keep those until the last session, but rest assured we are digesting those and making sure that we can give you a very comprehensive and thorough answer shortly. Just wanted to keep the presentations rolling so that we can keep us on track with the time. Okay, so we are hoping to get the polls coming. I can see that everyone is starting to vote. Thank you so much. These questions are, let me see, a lot of them are, both of them are about the report and about the types of things that you consider as an audience member to be the most important things for you. So Safra, I might even hand over to you to announce what the winners were and whether or not the audience is on target. A lot of these, by the way, don't have actual correct or wrong answers, but take it away.
Thank you. And actually, so I developed these questions, and my thought was really, while we have you all captive, it would be great to have your input as we're going through revisions. And so for question 6, what do you consider the most important topic for this guidance document? And forgive me, it looks like 54% responded. The most important part is how to provide IAS protection for new build infrastructure. 23% said the most important component would be how to future-proof a port and how to talk about climate change impacts. And 15% responded that the most important part was how to plan and respond to incursions. Oh, sorry. And did I read that right? I think 19% of you said it was how to protect existing infrastructure. And so what we'll do is we as a working group will take these answers and we'll make sure that we're hitting on those topics well, and that we've, that we put appropriate weight into each of them. So we appreciate your feedback.
Wonderful, thank you. We also had the second question, which was with regard to invasives, which of the following provides the best example of proactive port infrastructure management? First one was having a biosecurity plan. And let me just read the statistics there. 52% of you said B and C, and 16% of you said A and D. So A is having a biosecurity plan, and D is considering invasive alien species prevention in the initial stages of infrastructure design and maintenance. B and C were calling the relevant regulator when you know that an invasive is detected, and C is using biofoul cleaning technologies to remove a detected invasive. So that was a little bit of a trick question on my part. I added the word proactive there just to see if everyone was paying attention. So really there what we were trying to highlight was it's very important to consider having a biosecurity management plan if you have static infrastructure or you have an industry that works right on the cusp of that marine estuarine environment. The other component that we consider is extremely important from a proactive perspective is looking to consider invasive species preventions right from the beginning of when you're looking to design infrastructure or when you're looking at large maintenance programs, rather than say trying to retrofit it near the end when you've suddenly realised that maybe someone might find it important. So yes, that's our questions, and thank you so much, Safra. I wanted to now welcome to our virtual stage the next presentation topic. This presentation topic is practical steps for port marine biosecurity management. So extremely relevant and a nice segue from our last one. This is presenting will be Lisa Riley from Peel Ports, and she's also an extremely valuable member of our working group. So I will hand over to you, Lisa. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Nikki, and thanks very much for inviting me along to present today. So yeah, as Nikki says, I'm going to discuss the practical steps that we've been implementing within Peel Ports to reduce some of the invasive species introduction and transfer risks. So within Peel Ports, just a bit of a background to our port operations. We are one of the largest port groups in Europe, and we have sites throughout the UK. We handle around 65 million tonnes of cargo and around 26,000 vessel movements every year. And in the Port of Liverpool alone, we handle around 52,000 containers in just 1 month, welcoming around 15% of the UK's total port traffic. So potentially quite a significant risk for invasive species entering into our ports. We have statutory harbour authorities across England and Scotland, as you can see on the screen. And as part of our duties as a statutory harbour authority, we undertake regular maintenance dredging across all our locations. Now, the impact of invasive alien species on this ability to do maintenance dredging will become more apparent later on the next slide. So part of my role within Peel is to assess the port biosecurity risk and look at the practical measures that we can take to reduce the risks to our port operations, particularly focusing on the business risk of invasive species opposed to the environmental risk. But why is biosecurity important to our ports? Well, invasive alien species can present a number of different operational and business risks to our ports. As Safra was saying earlier, they can foul structures, smother water intake areas. Some species can build reefs across a berth and even burrow and reduce the structural stabilities of embankments, such as a Chinese mitten crab. But this becomes an issue if it means that it prevents us from carrying out our statutory harbour duties. For example, if we're unable to take dredging because of a fear of invasive species transfer, or if actually the presence of the species itself, such as the trumpet tubeworm, actually prevents us from physically being able to dredge to maintain that safe navigation depth for vessels into our ports. So aside from the operational risks of invasive species, there's also some wider ecosystem impacts, and this is through the displacement of native species. But why is this important? Well, because native species can provide a number of natural ecosystem resilience tactics for invasive non-native species, and if they are healthy functioning ecosystems, they're more likely to be able to fight off any invasions of species that come into our ports. Climate change, as Safra mentioned, is also increasing the likelihood of invasive species establishing within our ports, particularly with changing environmental conditions, different temperature ranges, salinities, etc. And this is also acting to reduce native species resilience to invasives. Regulatory attention to invasive non-native species is also growing recently. So port biosecurity is therefore a significant business risk to our ports in terms of liability for introducing or transferring invasive species, but also to the wider port operational risk as well for the reasons that Safra mentioned earlier. So the potential transfer of species between water bodies through dredging and disposal and vessel transfer is also a risk. And this is something I'll talk about in a minute in terms of how we've tried to help reduce this risk. But the practical issue here is for managing invasive species is very difficult for a port because we do have to remain operational throughout, but it's about reducing the biosecurity risk because, as you've seen, some of these species can pose quite significant risks to our port operations. Sorry, I don't seem to be able to change this slide. Thank you. So now I'm going to talk through some of the practical examples of what the risk has been within our ports and how we found some solutions to this. So first of all, we've got a risk of invasive alien species being transferred on equipment being used within the port. So this could be through contractors that we have working in the port, whether it's on their clothing or whether it's actually on plant equipment itself or even large equipment such as dredgers. So we're taking a number of different measures to reduce the risk of species transfer here by stipulating that contractors or colleagues working in the port actually undertake a biosecurity risk assessment before each activity, which is a high risk of species transfer, is undertaken. We've also developed an environmental checklist within our marine team, and this is used when we're carrying out our own work or when we're licensing a third party to do some work in our port, and this contains a biosecurity section. So again, where applicable, we will ask a risk assessment is undertaken to identify any measures that need to be taken to reduce the risk of species being introduced. Where possible, we may also look to add any conditions onto specific contracts where we perceive the risk to be particularly high. So that's just done on a case-by-case basis. We also have dredging contracts as well, which obviously dredgers are very important for our port operations, but we also have a requirement on these that the dredger actually undertakes a check, clean, dry procedure. So this is before the equipment's used in our ports, so it reduces the risk of invasive species being transferred across national and international boundaries during maintenance or capital dredge activities. So we found this is quite a simple and practical step that can be taken, particularly with some of the dredgers, because the apparatus, if it's transiting from quite a significant distance, it can leave the equipment out of the water, and then by the time it reaches its destination, it's already gone through the check, clean, dry process, so it doesn't have a significant impact on affecting their operations. Go on to the next slide. Thanks. So now this slide looks at the invasive species transfer during recreational boating events. So recreational watercraft such as yachts or paddleboarders and even anglers pose quite a significant pathway for invasive species to be transferred. And across our ports, we do have a variety of different environments, operational environments, but we also own some areas where we do have recreational activities taking place as well. And so to educate users of this sector about the risks of invasive species and how they can manage them, we held some workshops up in Liverpool and Clyde, up in Scotland, to understand both what measures local mariners were already taking to reduce the invasive species risk during their activities, but also to educate people on best practice and to look at some of the impacts that invasive alien species can actually have and explain the pathways that they can be transferred through their activities. So just really kind of a grassroots education of those marine users. We're also considering using social media to encourage visiting yachts and sailing craft to clean their hulls before they enter our ports as well. So again, a simple step of education to raise awareness of the impacts of some of these species can have, and some of the relatively simple measures that can be taken, such as check, clean, dry before they enter our ports. We also have regular port leisure users meetings as well, which helps us to work with our local stakeholders to deliver solutions to invasive species management in this way. And as part of this process, we actually did a workshop in the last year now with Bangor University in Wales, where they had a virtual marina, and participants were able to log into the virtual marina and have a walk around to understand some of the different species that were present, and how they spread on different pathways. So that was a really interesting different way of educating people. And I feel raising awareness of invasive alien species and why it's important is often quite a significant step in the quest to try and reduce their spread. The next slide, please. So sticking with recreational risk for recreational activity risk for transferring invasive species, this example that we've got on the slide here is particularly relating to angling fishing activity. So this example, we had some reports of New Zealand pygmy weed, which has been found in sites alongside the Manchester Ship Canal up in the northwest of England. And this is an area that anglers regularly use. The pygmy weed itself, if it transferred into the canal, it could have quite significant impacts on navigational safety. It's estimated a centimetre fragment of this New Zealand pygmy weed can actually grow into quite a significant plant, up to 3 metres long in depth in the water column. So it has impacts on blocking propellers on vessels, as well as restricting our ability to dredge because of the physical presence of the species restricting dredging apparatus getting in, but also because of the fear of transferring the species through dredging. So we really wanted to be careful that the species didn't transfer from the angling ponds alongside the canal into the canal. So in order to reduce the risk of the transfer from angling equipment being transferred from different water bodies, we worked with the Angling Trust to install some check, clean, dry signs along the entrance and exit points to the angling pools alongside the canal. And this just really raised awareness of invasive species and helped to reduce their spread, and educated a lot of the anglers on some of the practical, simple measures that they could take to reduce the risk of transferring species through their equipment. And we're also going to look at extending this to other sites where there is a similar risk of species transfer in this way. The next slide, please. And marine debris is quite another significant pathway for invasive species transfer, particularly in this new method called plastic rafting, where species can attach themselves onto the surface of plastic. So this has become a relatively new issue, particularly because plastics are not biodegradable. So if invasive species do attach to them, they're able to colonize them quite quickly and adapt and increase their resilience to different climatic variations as they're transported across oceans and other waterways into new environments. And in fact, following the Japanese tsunami back in 2011, almost 300 different marine invasive species are estimated to have been transported this way across the Pacific. So steps that we're looking at taking to reduce the risk around our ports is to regularly remove marine debris, such as ropes or other marine litter from the water, as this presents an opportunity to reduce the risk of transfer of invasive species through this pathway. We do regularly remove marine litter that acts as a navigational safety risk that might block propellers on vessels, but now that we're aware of the invasive species risk associated with it, this just makes it even more important that we need to control this particular route of invasives. We're also working with regulators in England to look at to quantify the risk of invasive species being transferred in this way using some eDNA technologies, which is really interesting. On to the next slide, please. Thank you. Another main pathway for invasive species and a risk of transferring them, as everyone will be aware in the marine environment, is biofouling and ballast water transfer. So commercial and recreational vessels both pose an equal risk to our ports in this regard. If they were to exchange ballast water that wasn't compliant with the Ballast Water Management Convention. As we saw earlier in the questions, a litre of water can contain up to 50 different, a litre of ballast water can contain up to 50 different marine invasive species. So as well as ballast water, another potential vector of invasive species transfer into our ports is through biofouling on vessel hulls. This problem's intensified recently due to global trade and global climate change, which is obviously two-pronged, increasing the frequency of vessels into ports, and also increasing the likelihood that they can survive once they and establish once they get into ports, particularly in enclosed dock areas where these are more stable, usually more stable environments than open ocean areas. As well, we see here as well ATON biofouling. So these are aids to navigation, or navigational buoys. The biofouling on these structures can present quite a significant navigational hazard for our ports, particularly because if these aren't cleaned, then they can be very difficult for mariners to be able to see them and understand them, and then therefore presents quite a significant safety risk. In Peel ports, we have cleaning of these undertaken regularly by a contractor, and when they clean these buoys with the biofouling on, they ensure the biofouling remains in situ and is does not get transferred across different areas of the sea from where the buoys are moored. If they are cleaned on land, the area is abundant and all debris is collected and any wash water is treated as well before it's discharged. So yes, in order to reduce the risk of biofouling, we've got quite strict criteria for any in-water hull cleaning within our ports. So if a vessel wants to undertake any hull cleaning to clean off the biofouling, they must have approval for the harbour master, and this is only allowed in very restricted circumstances if all biofouling, similar to the navigation aid cleaning, if all biofouling is collected and treated, the wash water is treated prior to any discharge. And because of this, it's very rare that any hull cleaning is undertaken across our ports. Finally, in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, we had a number of vessels laying up in our some of our ports, and we developed a compliance document for this to make sure that while they were laid up for quite prolonged periods, they weren't posing a significant biosecurity risk. So this involved stating that they were unable to take any hull cleaning. We requested an anti-fouling certificate. They must have undertook ballast water exchange in compliance with Ballast Water Management Convention, and undertake a biosecurity risk assessment for the duration of their stay. In addition to this, we also looked at the opportunity for advancing technologies such as environmental DNA or dive surveys in extreme circumstances, to understand a little bit more about what species are present on the hull. And this is just a consideration for vessels. It was the requirement for this was determined based on the outcome of their risk assessment. On to the next slide, please. Okay, so the final one that I've got about the risk of invasive species transfer today is the risk of invasive species being transferred into our port jurisdictions through natural events. So a couple of years ago now, carpet sea squirt was recorded in Holyhead Marina in Wales, and there was quite a destructive storm in the area, which caused a lot of floating debris from the marina to come out into the channel and move around. But this floating debris actually contained a lot of the carpet sea squirt. So in order to reduce the risk of this being spread into our ports, we worked to educate local mariners and marine users. So we worked with regulators in England and Scotland. We released a notice to mariners across our ports in Liverpool, Manchester and Heysham, and in Scotland, to advise mariners and port operatives on what the species look like and what they should do if they sighted the species or found any debris containing the species. And this was really just to try and reduce it being spread further. So on to the final slide, please. Thank you. So in terms of the next steps that we're looking at, we're going to be training local marine teams within our ports to understand a bit more about what pathways do present a risk for invasive species transfer into our ports. It's important when we do this that we include operational teams as well as our other marine teams, because these are the people that are going to be on the ground and with the ability to implement some of the management measures. So it's really important that we include everyone in this process. We're also developing a marine biosecurity plan as well, which contains a variety of the measures that I mentioned earlier, as well as some others. And this just allows measures to be put into place throughout day-to-day operational activities or commonplace activities to reduce things that can have a small time constraint on them, but can have quite a significant benefit on restricting the invasive species transfer. We're also looking at putting biosecurity requirements on our event permits as well, because often a lot of the recreational vessels kind of travelled quite significant distances to get to these, so do pose quite a significant risk for invasive species being introduced in this way into our ports. We're also looking at technological advances as well. So recently had a project with one of the regulators looking at environmental DNA. So here we take some samples of water around the ports. We filter it through a narrow filter, and then we fix this with a fixing agent and then send it off to the lab for some analysis. So this allows us to develop a bit of a baseline to understand what invasive species are present around our ports. And it also allows us to map them so we can understand some of the pathways where we can see common vessel movements that they might be spread. But with all of the stuff that I've spoke about today, it's worth remembering that in the UK, there is quite a significant lack of regulatory enforcement on invasive species. So we have the Ballast Water Management Convention, but in regards to biofouling management or any other sort of things like this within the marine sphere, it's quite difficult for us to impose something on vessels without it having a bit of a commercial disadvantage on us, because of the lack of top-down governance on some of these issues. For example, in Australia or New Zealand, they're quite strict on vessels that can and can't arrive into their ports if they don't meet the specific biofouling requirements and anti-fouling requirements. Recently, there was a case where a vessel was unable to dock because it didn't have there was an invasive species risk, and it got declined from a number of different ports across Australia and New Zealand. But unfortunately, in England and in the UK at the moment, there's just not that type of strict guidance that we can enforce. And throughout my presentation as well, you can see that there's quite a challenge of practical biosecurity management in a port as well, because we do need to operate as a port, but we need to make sure that we can implement measures to reduce the business risk associated with invasive species, as Safra mentioned earlier, block and intake areas, if they reduce the stability of some canal embankments, etc. But we still have to operate as a port, and it's just important to recognise this here and appreciate that the measures need to operate in accordance with our operations that are already existing. And so thanks very much for your attention, and I'll take any questions now, or we can take them later.
Hello again. We might grab the questions from the chat room and hold them again like we did last time for the last session, but we do have your poll questions. So as before, I'm introducing these. So hopefully everyone within the audience will have 2 questions that they can answer. And in a moment, when we get all of your answers collated, I'll hand back over to Lisa, and she can touch base on everyone's responses. And again, some of these have multiple answers, and some of them we've got one in mind. So let's see if we can trick you up again this time as well. And just to let you know, we're also continuing to collate those questions that are coming through from everyone in the audience as the speakers continue. So thank you so much for these questions, and we will either respond to some of the smaller ones directly in the chat, or we will we'll touch base with them right at the beginning of that last session. Excellent. We've just had some results come through. So Lisa, I'll run back to you and you can talk through those answers.
Thanks very much, Nikki. Yeah, so the first question What do you see being the main consequences to ports if they do not put biosecurity management in place?
Just quickly, I believe that we are trying to speed us up a little bit, so we have missed that question and jumped directly to question 9.
Okay, so what commercial opportunities do we see for ports? So yes, 10% said ports could harvest marine pests that establishers use them as commodities. 0% interestingly said that we would not look at developing bespoke cleaning facilities for any invasive species or biofouling vessels. And interestingly, 90% said no risks, establishments are too high to consider commercial opportunities. So some quite interesting results there. Maybe something that we can discuss later. I see that 0% have voted for any cleaning facilities. I don't know what happens in other countries, but in England, we don't really have anywhere to clean them. So would they go to specific cleaning areas perhaps? I don't know. But yes, lots of interesting comments there, particularly in regards to the risk being too high for transfer. And then on to the other questions. Sorry.
I was going to say, I think it's very interesting that some people said that we could harvest marine pests and establish them as many are marketable commodities in their country of origin.
Yes, I can see negatives with that as well, because it might increase the need for them as well. But yeah, lots of
absolutely. That was my other weird nerdy joke that some people didn't pick up on. But no, of course we would not be able to do that, you know, given the risks. Anyway, yes, sorry, Lisa, continue. Next question.
What do you consider the most difficult parts of biosecurity management for ports around the world? So we've got 22% said lack of resources to develop a regional baseline, which is quite an interesting one, particularly given the seasonal variation in invasive species, if we were looking at doing some data collection on them. Education, 11% voted for that, and 19% voted for cost of installing appropriate cleaning infrastructure. 48% said it was all of those, which I think is fair to say. Yeah, all of them play a part. Thank you, Nikki.
Wonderful, thank you so much. Okay, we are moving on now to our last presentation topic, which is ecological engineering solutions for enhanced biosecurity. Speaking us through this is Associate Professor Katie DeFawn from Macquarie University and Research Associate Nina Schaffer. I hope I have pronounced that last name correctly, with some of their extremely interesting research and field trials that they're looking at doing to improve biosecurity. Take it away, Nina and Catherine. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Nikki. And thanks so much to you and the working group for having us come and present this evening, because we're coming to you guys from Sydney. So I'm an associate professor at Macquarie University. And a little bit of a change of topic, because we're going to open the presentation by talking about a solution called living seawalls that's actually designed to encourage fouling on marine infrastructure, and to do that so that it provides more of a biodiversity benefit. But the reason that we're really interested in this topic is because there's such an increase in infrastructure being built into our oceans, and that includes things like seawalls, that includes things like marinas, it includes ports and all the structures, including things like artificial islands and offshore infrastructure that we're building as well. We're creating quite a large footprint. And that footprint is growing, and it has some significant impacts. Some work that we've done fairly recently has shown that the impact of these structures around the world now occupies more space than the world's seagrass and mangroves combined. So quite a sobering statistic. Next slide, please, Nina. And one of the reasons that these structures have such a massive impact on the environment, on the ecological communities around them, is because they just are so different to what we see in nature. They don't create the kind of habitats and protection that we see on some of our intertidal rocky shores, that we see in the pits and overhangs and rock pools, that we get the kind of complexity that lots of different sorts of marine creatures actually love. The kind of complexity that provides protection from predation, also protection from some of those climate stresses that we've already heard this evening are getting so much worse. Instead, when we have some of these artificial structures and infrastructure, we get really flat, featureless surfaces made of artificial materials. We get truncated intertidal zones, just reduced space overall and reduced protective microhabitats for things to live in. Next slide, please, Nina. And again, the work that we've done to measure both the scale of this problem and also what's happening in the future has shown that we're going to see about a 70% growth in different types of marine infrastructure by 2030. Some of that growth will be offshore with oil, gas, renewables, but the main area that we are going to see growth in marine infrastructure is around our exclusive economic zone, around our coastlines, and particularly in the port infrastructure. Next slide, please, Lena. And so I've been working with a group of ecologists in Sydney and an industrial designer to start thinking about, we understand what some of the impacts are, but how can we use that understanding to design infrastructure in a more ecologically friendly way? Next slide, Nina. And we've come up with this 3D printed, molded, and then cast concrete solution, which we've called the living seawall solution. They're basically modular panels that we can use to recreate a lot of the kinds of habitats that we see on rocky shores, that we see in mangrove forests, but that are actually missing from some of the infrastructure that we're building at the moment. Next slide, please, Nina. And it's work that's been informed by more than 20 years of science in Sydney Harbour, and we've done a lot of work kind of looking just experimentally at what can we do in a small way to marine infrastructure to encourage things to live there, just taking blocks out of seawalls, to adding on structures like flower pots from the local hardware store to kind of mimic the rock pools that we don't have on these structures, to using some of the new innovation in 3D printing technology to create on a more fine scale some of those habitats that we've lost. And the final picture on that slide, the habitat tiles, is actually something that's been tested in the World Harbour Project and installed in around 27 ports around the world to see, what happens when you add back in some of these crevices and ledges that are missing. How does that provide protection for marine life? Next slide, please, Nina. So the previous designs have been fairly small scale, little panels, 25 by 25 centimeters. We now have panels that are 55 by 55 centimeters, around 20 kilos, and we have over 1,000 panels installed, both Sydney Harbour and around the world. We've got several sites now where we've got living seawalls installed as well. We started with about 5 designs back in 2018 that were inspired by some of the natural rock formations that we see on our rocky shore, that were inspired by things like rock pools. And we now have 10 designs because we've started looking more subtitally to what kinds of features we could mimic, things like sponge gardens, things like the holdfasts on seaweeds, and basically continuing to test all of those in a really rigorous scientific way to understand how effective they actually are in creating these habitats for marine life and how effective they are in actually enhancing biodiversity compared to unmodified infrastructure. Next slide, please, Nina. So we have a really rigorous monitoring and assessment program where we go out with our quadrats, we go out with our GoPros, and we capture all the kinds of things that are growing on the panels, that are moving on and off the panels, things like snails and chitons, fish that are coming to feed from the panels and are using the panels for protection. And this is data from one of our oldest living seawalls that's right underneath the Sydney Harbour Bridge. And actually, it was a design originally sponsored by Volvo Cars, who were interested in doing something sustainable in the oceans. So this has been installed for around 2 years now, and we see almost double the number of species living on our living seawall compared to some of our reference seawalls that haven't been modified by these panels. Next slide, please, Nina. We also, just looking at some of the specific designs that we have, the rock pool design, rock pool panel that we have has shown so far to be the most effective encouraging biodiversity. And we see up to 3 times more species on that panel design compared to some of the other ones that we have. But what we've also found is that you don't want to just have a whole wall of our rock pool panel design. It really benefits the diversity and variety in the community if you can combine several different design types depending on the sort of location that's being installed at. Next slide, please, Nina. So as I said before, we've got more than 1,000 panels, around 18 sites now in the world, primarily in Sydney Harbour. We've got about 13 in Sydney Harbour installed, but we do have sites in Singapore, sites in Townsville, 2 sites going into Wales, and just recently through the Earthshots program that Prince William is running, we've now got 2 sites that are going to go into Boston Harbour. So we've managed to test this in Sydney Harbour and shown that it has really great benefits for our marine life, but we're starting to gather that evidence from a lot of different places around the world as well. One of the places that we're also expanding to is we're not just interested in seawalls, we're really interested in other kinds of structures. And because we have this modular solution, we can adapt it to things like pilings, we can adapt it to things like offshore structures, and port infrastructure is one of the areas that we've started to work on with DP World. So that's one of the areas where we see the most growth in infrastructure and probably a lot of potential on structures that don't require to be clear of fouling, to actually have some really nice biodiversity benefits in ports through using something like this. But at the same time, and this leads nicely into Nina, we don't want to encourage invasive species using this kind of solution. So we have been documenting on all of our living seawalls what the contributions are of native and non-native biodiversity. And Nina is going to tell you a bit more about how something like this and other eco-engineering solutions can be used to try and design away that sort of risk of incursions on marine infrastructure. Nina.
Thank you, Katie. So today I'm going to talk to you a bit about a project that I have been working on for the past 3 years. It's also about ecological engineering for marine infrastructure, but it has a particular focus on marine biosecurity, so to prevent the settlement and establishment of invasive species in particular. So as we usually start on a project, we want to know what's already known about infrastructure and how certain design features might influence the colonization of marine species or invasive species in particular. So what we started off with was a literature review, looking at different design features of marine infrastructure that could potentially influence the settlement. And we found that material type, material brightness, complexity, movement, orientation, also light, because obviously that's related to orientation, and native biota were things that could be potentially influenced to reduce the settlement of NIS or invasive species. And just to keep it very short on what we've done in our first year, we found that material type, material brightness, complexity, and light had the most had the most potential to have an effect on invasive species and in reducing their establishment on these structures. So what we first done was we did some experiments. First focusing on brightness and microtexture. So we had these gray, white, and black plates that were either smooth or had like a little microtexture on them. And then we also had an experiment here that had an oyster cover, a sandstone cover, or just concrete material as the substrate, settlement substrate for any sort of biota, really. And we deployed them in at different sites in Sydney Harbour, but also along the east coast of Australia. And to just give you
bit of a not super detailed summary of the results. I have more details in reports, and I'm happy to share them as well if you like. So a summary of all these experiments is that we found some trends, but the responses varied across taxa and locations. So there's not really a one-size-fits-all approach to invasive species management. And both actually substrate material, as well as brightness and microtexture, were not effective in broad spectrum marine biosecurity management. But because we did find some effects of those manipulations, depending on what kind of taxa we looked at, for example, bryozoans or lace corals, as they're also called, they really like the dark plates, whereas polychaetes or like tube worms that we heard about beforehand, they really like light plates. So there are actually some things we can do about it. So if you know what the local invasive species are, you can definitely incorporate these kind of features into newly built infrastructure to reduce their settlement. But then we said, okay, it's a very taxon-specific approach, so we want to make it a bit easier. So we thought, okay, we need a functional group approach. So we had a look at Australia in particular, and what kind of invasive species we have here in Australia. And I've plotted here for you the different invasive species or species defined as marine pests in Australia and their distribution across Australia. And as you can see here on the left, the invertebrates are all over the place. And the algae here on the right, they're mainly concentrated in the southeast of Australia. So of the pest species in Australia, of the marine ones, 47% are actually sessile invertebrates and only 8% are algae. And because marine invertebrates or the marine pest species are so much more widely distributed across Australia, and they also dominate the fouling communities on marine infrastructure, we thought we'll try to find a solution to prevent the colonization of marine pests that are sessile invertebrates in particular. And sessile invertebrates actually do really like shade. So we wanted to have a look, is shade possibly something that could assist in them establishing all over the place? Is that an issue in port or in different ports across Australia? So we had a look at overwater structures in Australia. I just went on Google Maps basically and mapped out all the overwater structure that I could possibly find in the different ports in Australia and just assessed their area. And shading is actually a problem in ports in Australia. Of the 58 ports that we have assessed, 7 ports had over 100,000 square meters of shaded seafloor. That's quite a lot. And the worst offender had 282,000 square meters of shaded seafloor. I think that's approximately 57 or 52 sports fields. So it's quite a large area in just one port. And only 16 out of 58 ports had less than 10,000 square meters of shaded seafloor. So shading is really something that could potentially help the establishment of invasive marine invertebrates. So because they love shade, or invasive invertebrates or invertebrates in general love shade a lot, we thought, okay, the most intuitive thing is to increase light levels and reverse the shading effects. So we wanted to test whether increased light levels actually reduce the settlement of invertebrates as a whole group. So that would include both invasive invertebrates as well as native invertebrates. So we did an experiment. Actually, we did 2. So we had 2 different deployments. One time we used these big and small lights on the top. And for the second experiment, unfortunately, we had to go and use different lights. So those were the treatments here at the bottom. So we had a strong and a moderate light treatments for first deployment and a moderate and low light treatment for the second deployment. And then we also used settlement planes that had different predation treatments. So we had a cage control, which was open to predators, uncaged, again, open to predators, and caged. So predators had no access to the settlement plate, so could not eat anything of it. And what we've done is we deployed the sediment plates under a jetty for 6 weeks. And we had the different light treatments, as I've mentioned before. And we had the lights on from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. because we didn't want to introduce artificial light at night, because that kind of comes with its own issues. And then we also had to look at sediment plates that were under fully shaded treatments. So we didn't expose them to any sort of light. And one natural light treatment. So the sediment plates were basically were deployed next to the jetty, so under natural sunlight. And after about 6 weeks, this is what the plates look like. These are the plates that were under the cage control. So the predecessor had no access, because I thought, okay, that's visually the best way to show you what we found. So we had the full shade treatment here on the left with a lot of invertebrates on them. These are actually 2 invasive bryozoans in Sydney Harbour. And then the more light we put onto the plates, the more algae we get. And here on the right, we have the strong light treatments. It's just algae, basically. And same for the second deployment, it wasn't as strong of a light, but we get the same sort of trend. So under the full shade treatment, lots of invertebrates, and the more light we put onto it, the more algae we get. And what this looks like in numbers, I've plotted here. This is just the mean proportion of the different groups that we've identified. So algae, invertebrates, or others, and their space. This is just from the first deployment. And as you can see, we have here the full shade and here the different light treatments. And what's pretty clear is that light reduces the cover of invertebrates and increases the cover of algae. That's pretty straightforward here. We also found that only the strong light treatment prevented the invertebrate recruitment entirely, because here under the cage treatment and even like under the no shade control treatments, we still get a bit of invertebrate recruitment. Then predation reduces the cover of both invertebrates and algae, which is not really surprising. Fish eat, so we get a reduction of both types of communities. And then finally, we also had a bit of a difference in community structure depending on how much light we actually put onto those plates. So under moderate or low light conditions, we usually had a lot of filamentous algae, and we had more branching algae in the strong light treatment. So what we can take from this is that both predation and light intensity affect sessile communities, and that is something that we could take into consideration when we build a new infrastructure. So what we've done next is we wanted to link different light levels to biotic communities, and for that we've done a survey in Sydney Harbour. And we did it at a couple of locations that I've plotted for you here. And we basically went and had a look at the biotic communities on pylons around the harbour. And what we found is, first of all, here a bit of the light levels that we get under infrastructure. So we had a look at the different rows under wharfs. And as you can see here on the top, the back of the pylons basically get almost no light. It's really not much happening there. And only here at the bottom, where you can see we have, depending on the row, we have a lot of light in the first row of the pylons. But the further we go back, the more the light reduces, obviously. And in the third row, we already have very, very low light levels. And this was actually reflected in the communities that we found on those pylons. So as you can see here in these two plots, algae on top and invertebrates at the bottom, the mean cover of algae was very high in the first row, and then increased like the further we went onto the infrastructure, and also decreased actually with depth, which is not really surprising because with depth we get a decrease in light levels. And obviously opposite to that, the invertebrates increased significantly from the first row to the second row, and also with depth. And on the back of the pylons, actually, we basically only got invertebrates. So even the little light levels that you might get there, no algae survives at all. So shading of infrastructure massively favors marine invertebrates, and light levels need to be increased if we wanted to prevent that. So where from here? So we've consulted with some stakeholders to discuss possible options and how we could implement this in actual ports. And one option would be to reduce the settlement substrate, for example, reducing the number of pylons by using, for example, a cantilever, which is a structure that is anchored on only one side. So that way we wouldn't have any pylons. And that would also be very useful in case we had invasive algae in a port as well as invertebrates, because then we would just reduce the amount of possible settlement ground for any sort of marine pests. Then another possibility is obviously to increase natural light levels using skylights or light paths, gridded surfaces, etc. And then also another possibility is to use artificial light, for example, the underwater lights that we used, or overwater lights as well. But what we still need is larger scale experiments to really test this on a larger scale basis, and also cost benefit analyses, because that's often really important for port managers, because they will know how much they need to pay to have these eco-engineered structures. And yeah, just a final acknowledgement of all my collaborators. This was not just my research. I had a really great team behind me, and I want to thank them all for their help over the past 3 years. And here, as I mentioned, I have some more detailed results in different reports of mine. So they're already available online on ResearchGate, but you can also just send me an email, and I'm happy to send them through to you. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Nina. That was fantastic. We also have a few questions that for the audience as well to summarise your topic. So I will again waffle on for a little bit until we get some answers, and then you can take it away and have a chat to the audience about the responses. In my day job, considering it's night now, but anyway, over here in Australia, in my day job, I work for North Queensland Bulk Ports Corporation. We have 4 ports, 3 of which are directly adjacent to the Great Barrier Reef World Heritage Area. So looking at any ways that we as a port authority can consider enhancing naturally biosecurity measures within our ports, whether that be on our static artificial infrastructure or within our natural environment in and surrounding our port location. We very much want to take the bull by the horns, as it will, and I think it's quite becoming a lot more common these days that my industry really do want to start engaging a lot more with both regulators and researchers alike to bring together these enhanced solutions for these types of problems. So yeah, I really do appreciate you coming along to speak today, and yes, it's can't wait to see the next stage. And I have waffled enough, so here are your answers. I'll let you talk through them. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Nicola. We first wanted to know which out of the below IAS types are the most at risk for incursion and establishment in ports, and therefore on waterborne transport infrastructure. We had 20, I hope I'm reading this right. So yeah, crustaceans, we had 24% of you, that was one of the major types of invasive species. 35% have non-vascular seaweed and or algae, 24% vascular plants such as seagrass, and 6% all of you. All of those above. Sorry, I can't really see where the 24% belong to. Sorry, maybe I've just read those wrong. So 24% crustaceans, 35% mollusks. Sorry, that's the way it is. 24% non-vascular seaweeds and 6% vascular plants such as seagrass, and 24% all of the above. So it's about half and half between invertebrates and vascular plants as a whole. So that's nice to see. And when we're talking about what structures are most prominent in the different ports or estuaries that could benefit from potential eco-engineering solutions, such as living seawalls or what I presented. And we have seawalls are presented by about, or the major kind of structure for 33% of you, pontoons only 70%, pylons 21%, and all of the above 50%. So seawalls are definitely the main structure, but we need solutions for all of these structures. So that's really good to know for us.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Nina. Just getting my camera to work. Yes, thanks so much for that. Now, look, I do understand if some of our audience may need to head off soon. We have run over time a bit. However, we are now up to our interactive session, which is titled Climate Change, Invasive Alien Species and Maritime Infrastructure Risks. So really the way that we wanted to conduct this session is really just to open again to the floor with some of those questions and have some discussions internally with the panel that we have here up on the speakers, and also receive any questions that the audience might have. So I hope that some of you can stay with us for a little bit longer, and we'll get that going. So the polling questions should be coming through now, and there will be 3 of them. And then what I'm going to do is actually hand over to Aaron Shard, who is also the Joint Secretary alongside myself for the PIANC Working Group. So he's worked in this area for many, many years. So he will run through the answers to these polling questions with you, and then elaborate as needed, and we'll then take some questions from the floor. So I'm just waiting to see how long it's going to take for these questions to come through. I'll start. The first question is, what are sleeper species? So some of the options are species that hibernate or have periods of senescence and then periods of high activity and reproduction or fecundity. The second option you can choose is native species or innocuous naturalised species that become pests in response to environmental change. And the third option is a term used for marine species that are sessile and not prone to spreading. Okay, the second question. I will hand it over to Aaron. I'm sure all of the rest of the answers will be along very shortly, but we've got some questions, answers coming through right now. So Aaron, I'll hand the floor over to yourself to start it.
Thanks, Nikki, and thanks everyone for their presentations today. It was really informative. So yeah, the first question is, what are sleeper species? And we have 36% that gave the response that native species are innocuous naturalized species that become pests in response to environmental change. And 18% a term used for marine species that are sessile or
I think actually we read from the bottom up. So 45% answered a term used for marine species, and so on.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Okay, yes. 45% a term used for marine species that are sessile, not prone to spreading there. And then 18% and native species are innocuous and naturalized species that become pests. And then 36%, that first option, the species that hibernate or have periods of senescence. And the correct response there is B, that native species are innocuous naturalized species that become pests in response to a particular environmental change. So there, a lot of, I guess the, topic of our report is invasive alien species. So, one thing we have to remember is that just because a species is non-indigenous or exotic or native does not mean it doesn't does or does not cause a problem to infrastructure or ecological damages. So all species, whether or not they're exotic or not, will cause problems or have a potential to. And then we have our second question, I believe, here with respect to waterborne transport infrastructure. What are the key concerns climate change pose to IAS risks? So the first response is an increase in extreme weather events. which we got 6% there. The next, a change in the warming patterns, ocean acidification, and other water quality influences, 53%. And the third, a change in global currents, a consequential change in shipping routes. And then D, there's no impact. And so the correct answer is actually B and C there. So both a change in the warming patterns and a change in the global current. So many factors are going to be affected there, with the key concerns of climate change risk in terms of invasive alien species. And we have our third one, which is the last poll question on this session, is those with oversight or over waterborne transport infrastructure, such as port operators, owners, and authorities, have the capacity to proactively address both climate change influences on infrastructure as well as IAS risk. And this is a true or false. So pretty clear here that this is true, and 91% go there, that with strong biosecurity planning, alternative infrastructure types, materials, anything to mitigate on should be acted on. So that's the most resilient and kind of robust response in terms of this, because in terms of climate change influences, I think there was a question about whether it's easy to detect if a species is moving around because of water transport or climate change, for example. And it's a very difficult question to answer. So regardless of the situation, strong biosecurity planning, strong monitoring, adaptive management is always necessary in these situations. And I guess I'll hand it back over to Nikki, maybe for some more discussion, or stop her there.
I was gonna add a key component to both biosecurity and monitoring are that if they don't, they can't be just an initial monitoring effort and biosecurity effort. They really need to be maintained, updated adaptively throughout the course of managing, the said infrastructure. And that's because even without climate change, the risk continues. So there's a continued risk, and that risk is dynamic, both because the vessel patterns are changing and because the recipient habitat suitability is changing. So it really needs to be an ongoing, persistent effort for biosecurity and both monitoring.
Absolutely, and I think we've also been responding to some of the questions that have come through the audience chat as well as we've gone through these topics today. And one of the key things that I think that isn't necessarily automatically considered when we talk about invasive alien species and climate change is the interesting new research and data that's come out regarding the potential greenhouse gas emission savings that can be generated by more frequent cleaning of hulls. So we touched earlier with Lisa on in-water cleaning options and the potential to introduce bespoke cleaning options within port facilities around the world. Now, more and more we're seeing those options being explored, and the technologies around those activities improving significantly. One of our audience members identified the key concerns that anti-fouling coatings, especially toxicant release ones, pose to the environment. So on one hand, you may be making sure that your vessel hull is cleaned and dealing appropriately to neutralise those invasive risks by either dry docking it or cleaning it and filtering the water. But on the other hand, are we also safely managing the potential releases of toxicants from I guess, impacting to some extent those coatings. So for some, I'm sure many of you are aware, but many of the anti-foul coatings work in a way so that they slowly release a toxicant within the waterway to act as a behavioural deterrent and to damage the cell walls of your microfouling so that they can't establish on the hulls, and therefore the vessel stays clean and undamaged. More and more research is going into ways to collect and filter that cleaning effluent, and also remove, not just neutralise the biosecurity risk, but also look at removing those toxicants. So in that way, these are options, for example, that those within professions supporting ports or marinas or those type of static artificial infrastructures in that environment, we can look to those as commercial opportunities that not just offer us enhanced biosecurity management, but also offer us the ability to undertake that safely and to facilitate our customers to be able to improve and reduce their greenhouse gas profile. So that's a little bit of, I guess, another angle to the full story. When it comes to climate change as well, it's important really to not underestimate the potential risk associated with species such as that we mentioned in one of the questions, the sleeper species. There's quite a lot of sophisticated distribution modelling tools that are starting to become more widely used that can predict how climate change will influence individual species geographic distributions. And some of those modelling tools are being used to then allow us to proactively ensure that biosecurity planning and management at the port interface is able to be reactive to that, to always try to be, as many steps ahead of these risks as possible, I guess. It's not a fail-safe plan, but mitigation is, the best that we can do. And we want to look at the most advanced tools that we have available for that. Safra, do you have anything else to add to that?
I also added in some of the responses that I think likely showed up in the chat earlier, that there are also several modeling studies that look at various vectors and overlay climate change, some of what Nikki had said. In addition, and then in a separate but related effort within the core group, we are developing a model as well, focuses on the southeastern coast of the United States, that tries to look at looks at some of those things. In addition, we've added the disturbance of harbor deepening and dredging projects. And so that is in development. As part of that work, we've also done a review of these types of models, and that will be coming out as a government report fairly soon. It's with the editors right now. So that will be publicly available. It may be of use. Very
interesting. I'll open to the floor of the panel, really, and also the floor of the audience. If you have any questions that you want us to mull over and shoot you back our answers, just write them into the chat, and we have some fantastic people here helping us to transfer it over to us as the speakers. Anyone else in the panel, though? Any topics that come to mind? Any
Nikki,
points you didn't quite make before?
I had a question for you, Nikki, on the anti-foul coatings, and that was, a question there. I'm not familiar with. I'm familiar kind of with what they do. Is there any regulation on that, and what's the incentives for boat operators to use them?
To use the anti-foul coatings?
Yeah, I mean, other than it protects their ships and moves and stops moving, IAS around or other organisms and stuff like that. How is it regulated, and how many operators use those? I know you said there's a lot of research going on right now about some ecological effects and things like that. But yeah, I'm more interested in just kind of the overall regulation in terms globally, that framework and incentives. If there's what your thoughts on that?
I understand that. Look, I can't necessarily provide you with as comprehensive an answer as I want, but I can give you some information about what I do know. There's a fair amount of work being undertaken within some of the IMO working groups or IMO project groups. The Glow Fouling project team have also provided some information on different types of coatings and their effectiveness, and their I guess their stance to undertake a review like that is from the perspective of biofouling and biofoul management. So which ones are most effective for biofoul management, but also if you were to increase maintenance on certain different types of coatings for vessels, which coatings are more resilient to those additional or more frequent maintenance activities. So if you were to clean a vessel more frequently, would you find that certain types of coatings may degrade in their effectiveness more quickly? The short answer to that is absolutely, they do. In fact, there's also a variety of different types of toxicant release coatings as well. So certain toxicant release coatings rely on having toxicants bound in a polymer that whereby the polymer slowly degrades over time by design, and the degrading of the polymer releases the toxicant. And then the other type of another type of toxicant release anti-fouling is where the coating itself has a specific content of, say, copper or other heavy metal type toxicant, and that is able to slowly leach out or slowly slough off through the friction effects of them transiting. Majority of these types of coatings are, I'm talking kind of the commercial scale vessels. There's a lot of research occurring of late about different and novel approaches to coating designs that allow them to move away from the toxicant release ones, so that essentially, you know, if you it's basically, you know, if you know it's a risk, you try to get rid of it. It's the, you know, safety hierarchy or whatever they call it. So some of these types of controls are things like retrofitting vessel hulls with what Nina has just put in our post with UVC lights, and looking at they've identified that especially for a commercial vessel that is essentially majority of the time in motion, UVC lights have shown to be quite effective at reducing or stopping that microfouling, and sorry, I lost my train of thought there. UVC lights have been shown to be quite effective at stopping the microfouling growth and having quite low non-target impacts as well, because it doesn't stretch so far. Ultrasonics is also another option that's been considered for retrofitting or for I guess impregnating into coatings, so that micro sound bubbles essentially are released into the water as a pulse directly, you know, within the proximity of the hull or the parts of the vessel, and those micro bubbles will use non-inertia convection essentially to destroy cell walls, RNA and the like, for any marine pests that might be within that small close proximity as well. So there's a fair amount of research going on for vessel coatings, and it's it's really quite a very interesting field in that some of these types of advances have the potential option to be retrofitted for certain static infrastructure. I mean, not necessarily directly comparable, of course, because you've got a variety of different types of static infrastructure, different construction materials, different profiles, different shapes, etc., etc. But yes, I've waffled a lot, but that's the answer to your question. That's what I know about anti-fouling coating and about what's being done to consider managing or improving on marine pests risks.
Yeah, thank you.
So I think we've, I don't think we've had any more questions from the audience. So thank you so much to everyone who has come to join. I have 2 more slides, which I'll very quickly go through. The first one here that you can see essentially identifies that we really think it's a great idea for everyone to join PIANC. And here are all of the reasons. There's 7 of them. And I have to say, I've got a significant amount, both professionally and personally, out of being involved in PIANC. I think it's a really fantastic industry representative body that allows me to grow professionally and allows me to indulge the very scientific, nerdy person inside of me that wants to get down to all of the detail. So if you're like me, join PIANC because they definitely can fit the bill for that. And the last slide, if I can get it to work. The last slide is click here to join. So yes, click here to join, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I really hope that you all got a lot out of the presentations that we were able to offer. And we really absolutely want to hear from you for pretty much any reason. Reach out if you just want to say hello. Reach out if you'd like to be involved in this working group. Reach out if you've got any comment for additional inclusions in our guidance document. And yeah, reach out if you want to join PIANC or anything like that. We would love to hear from you. Thank you so much. And it is quite late over in Australia now, so I'm going to head off to bed. Thank you so much, everyone. Goodbye.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Nikki.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.